Sicily, July 10, 1943. Dawn broke slowly over the rolling wheat fields near Gela, painting the Mediterranean sky in streaks of amber and rose. The air smelled of wild thyme and salt water, carried inland by winds that had crossed 1,000 miles of open sea. In the distance, the ancient stone walls of farmhouses stood silent, their shutters closed against what was coming. The earth trembled first, a low, distant rumble that might have been thunder, except the sky held no clouds. Then came the mechanical growl, unmistakable and growing louder. Tank engines, many of them. Lieutenant Giuseppe Ferretti stood in the commander's cupola of his M1340 medium tank, squinting toward the horizon where dust plumes rose like brown smoke. He was 24 years old, a veteran of North Africa who had survived Tobruk and El Alamein, who had watched Rommel's Africa Corps retreat across endless desert under British and American firepower. His hands, calloused and oil-stained, gripped the edge of the cupola as his crew waited below in tense silence. The M13-40 around him was all he had: 14 tons of riveted steel, a 47mm main gun, and armor that measured at its thickest point just 42 millimeters. He knew its limitations intimately. Every Italian tanker did. They had learned them in blood across Libya and Tunisia. But orders were orders. The Americans had landed on Sicily's southern coast before dawn, pouring out of landing craft by the thousands, and now they were pushing inland. Ferretti's unit, part of the Livorno division, had been rushed forward to meet them, to throw the invaders back into the sea before they could consolidate their beachhead. The fascist high command spoke of glory and duty, and the inevitable triumph of Italian arms. Ferretti spoke none of these things to his crew. He checked his ammunition count: 32 rounds of 47mm armor-piercing, each one carefully loaded and secured. And he waited. The first American tank appeared at 07:20 hours. It crested a low hill, perhaps 800 meters distant, silhouetted against the rising sun, and for a moment Ferretti could not quite process what he was seeing. The machine was massive, far larger than his own M1340, broader and taller, with a profile that seemed to fill the horizon. Even at this distance, he could make out the long barrel of its main gun, the heavy cast turret, the tracks that churned earth as it rolled forward with mechanical inevitability. Behind it came another, then another. 5, 6, 7 Shermans, advancing in a loose wedge formation, their olive-drab hulls caked with beach sand and seawater. Ferretti's radio crackled. His battalion commander's voice, sharp and urgent. "All units, engage at maximum range. Fire at will." He dropped into the turret, his world contracting to the cramped steel interior where his gunner, Corporal Dante Rossi, was already traversing the main gun toward the lead Sherman. The breech smelled of gun oil and old propellant. Sweat trickled down Rossi's temple as he peered through the telescopic sight, calculating range and deflection with the speed born of 2 years' practice. The loader, a boy from Calabria barely 18 years old, clutched a 47mm round against his chest, knuckles white. "Range 800, Rossi muttered. "Targeting lead vehicle." "Fire when ready," Ferretti said. The 47mm gun roared. Inside the tank, the sound was deafening, a physical blow that left ears ringing even through padded headsets. The spent casing ejected with a metallic clang, bouncing off the turret floor. Through the vision port, Ferretti watched the tracer arc toward the Sherman and strike its glacis plate dead center. For one heartbeat, he thought they had scored a kill. Then the tracer ricocheted skyward in a shower of sparks, spinning away harmlessly into the wheat fields beyond. The Sherman did not stop. It did not even slow. Its turret traversed with hydraulic smoothness, the long 75mm gun swinging toward Ferretti's position with terrible, unhurried precision. In that instant, Giuseppe Ferretti understood. They had been outmatched before the first shot was fired. Italian armored forces that landed in Sicily in the summer of 1943 were not the proud, mechanized divisions that Benito Mussolini had promised to deliver. They were the remnants of a military-industrial complex that had never truly modernized, cobbled together from pre-war designs and manufactured in factories that lacked the capacity for mass production. The M1340 medium tank, Italy's primary armored fighting vehicle, had entered service in 1940 as a stopgap measure, an attempt to field anything, that could challenge British armor in North Africa. Its designers had worked within impossible constraints: limited steel allocations, obsolete industrial machinery, and a leadership that demanded quantity over quality. The result was a vehicle that looked impressive in propaganda photographs but faltered catastrophically in combat. The M1340 weighed 14.5 tons, powered by a 125-horsepower diesel engine that pushed it to a maximum speed of 32 to 2 kilometers per hour on roads, and far slower across broken terrain. Its main armament, the 47mm L-32 gun, could penetrate 43 millimeters of armor at 500 meters under ideal conditions. Its own armor, meanwhile, ranged from 42 millimeters on the turret front to just 25 millimeters on the hull sides. Protection sufficient against rifle-caliber bullets and shell fragments, but woefully inadequate against modern anti-tank weapons. Italian tankers knew these specifications by heart. They had learned them not from technical manuals, but from experience, from watching their rounds bounce off British Matildas and American Grants, from feeling their own armor crack and shatter under enemy fire. By 1943, the M1340 was obsolete, a relic facing an enemy whose industrial might had produced something entirely different. The American M4 Sherman medium tank arrived in Sicily as the embodiment of United States industrial philosophy, mass production, standardization, and overwhelming material superiority. Weighing 30 tons in its basic configuration, the Sherman was powered by radial aircraft engines or diesel power plants producing between 400 and 500 horsepower, giving it superior speed and mechanical reliability. Its 75mm M3 gun fired shells that could penetrate 60 to 70 millimeters of armor at combat ranges, and its own frontal armor, 51 millimeters on the hull, 76 millimeters on the cast turret, was effectively immune to Italian 47mm fire at any realistic engagement distance. But the Sherman's true advantage lay not in any single specification. It was the product of an industrial system that could manufacture 50 tanks for every one Italy produced, that could ship them across the Atlantic in convoys protected by naval and air superiority, that could supply them with ammunition and fuel and spare parts in quantities Italian commanders could barely imagine. The Sherman crews that rolled onto Sicilian beaches carried not just tanks, but the weight of an entire continent's industrial output behind them. Giuseppe Ferretti did not know these numbers as he fought that morning near Gela, but he felt their reality in every engagement. Every moment his crew fired and missed, fired and watched their shells ricochet, fired and saw nothing change except the Sherman's turret turning toward them with lethal patience. The second shot came from the lead Sherman at 7:24 hours. The 75mm gun fired with a deep, hollow boom that carried across the wheat fields, and the high-explosive shell crossed 800 meters in less than 2 seconds. It struck Ferretti's M1340 on the left side of the turret, just below the commander's cupola. The Italian armor, riveted plates bolted to a steel framework, simply came apart. The shell punched through 42 millimeters as if it were cardboard, detonating inside the crew compartment with catastrophic force. Ferretti remembered light, blinding white light, and heat, and a sensation of being lifted and thrown sideways all at once. His ears registered nothing but a high, sustained ringing tone. When his vision cleared, he was lying in the wheat 10 meters from his tank, staring up at blue sky while black smoke boiled from the shattered turret behind him. He could not remember exiting the vehicle. Some autonomous part of his nervous system had taken over, pulling him through the cupola and throwing him clear before conscious thought returned. He rolled onto his hands and knees, coughing, tasting blood and cordite. His uniform was smoking. 20 meters away, his M1340 burned, flames licking from every hatch and vision port, ammunition cooking off inside with sharp, irregular cracks. There was no sign of his crew. Rossi, the Calabrian boy, the driver whose name he suddenly could not recall. All gone, consumed in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Ferretti stumbled toward a drainage ditch as the Sherman column advanced. Through ringing ears, he heard other Italian tanks firing, the distinctive crack of 47mm guns, followed by the heavier reports of American 75mm cannons. One by one, the sounds of Italian resistance faded. He crawled into the ditch and lay there in 6 inches of muddy water, watching through the wheat stalks as the Shermans rolled past his position, massive and unstoppable, their tracks crushing down the summer grain in parallel furrows. They moved with a kind of mechanical arrogance, turrets traversing slowly from side to side, searching for targets. Their engines produced a steady, confident rumble, not the labored whine of Italian diesels struggling against terrain, but the deep throb of excess power held in reserve. Even their exhaust smoke seemed different. Darker, thicker, the signature of engines fed with more fuel than they strictly needed, burning it simply because they could. In the weeks that followed, as Allied forces pushed across Sicily toward Messina, Giuseppe Ferretti would hear similar stories from surviving tankers. Always the same pattern. Italian units advancing to contact, opening fire at maximum range, watching their armor-piercing rounds spark harmlessly off Sherman armor, then dying as American guns replied with methodical precision. The 47mm could not penetrate, and no amount of courage or tactical skill could compensate for simple physics. The kinetic energy required to defeat 76mm of cast armor at combat range exceeded what Italian guns could deliver. Some crews tried desperate measures. They closed to point-blank range, attempting to target vision ports or turret rings, the few weak points where 47mm shells might find purchase. A handful succeeded, knocking out Shermans with shots to the engine deck or lucky hits on ammunition stowage. But these were exceptions, brief moments of success overwhelmed by the broader reality. For every Sherman disabled, 5 more appeared. For every Italian tank that survived an engagement, 3 were lost. The mathematics were brutal and inescapable. The M1340's armor could not protect its crew from Sherman fire. The M1340's gun could not threaten a Sherman frontally. Speed, maneuverability, crew training, none of these advantages existed in sufficient measure to overcome the fundamental disparity in design and industrial capacity. Italian tankers were not cowards. They fought with the weapons given to them, followed orders, and died in steel coffins that offered only the illusion of protection. By the time Giuseppe Ferretti reached friendly lines 3 days after the battle at Gela, half of Sicily's armored units had been destroyed or abandoned. He walked into a rear area assembly point near Enna on July 13th, still wearing his burned tanker's overalls, and found chaos. Tanks sat beside dirt roads with thrown tracks or seized engines, stripped for parts to keep a few running. Crews huddled in the shade of olive trees, smoking cigarettes and speaking in low, defeated voices. A captain from the Livorno division told Ferretti that his battalion no longer existed as a combat-effective unit. 14 tanks destroyed, 9 abandoned, 3 broken down and left behind during the retreat. Ferretti sat on the ground with his back against a stone wall and tried to process what he had experienced. He kept seeing the Sherman's turret traversing toward him, slow and deliberate, the long gun barrel perfectly steady despite the tank's movement across rough ground. He kept hearing the sound of the 75 mm shell striking his turret, that terrible ringing impact that came an instant before white light and heat. He kept thinking about Rossi, who had been a good gunner, who had survived North Africa only to die on Sicilian soil in a fight that had been lost before it began. What surprised him was not the defeat itself. By 1943, Italian soldiers had grown accustomed to losing, to retreating, to making do with inadequate equipment, while German allies fought with tanks and planes and artillery that actually worked. What surprised him was the scale of the mismatch, the sheer overwhelming material superiority the Americans deployed so casually. The Shermans had not fought cleverly or used brilliant tactics. They had simply driven forward and shot anything that opposed them, absorbing Italian fire without effect and replying with devastating accuracy. It was not war as Ferretti had understood it. It was industrial slaughter, production capacity translated into combat power, the assembly line rendered as armored column. The American experience of that same battle near Gela was recorded in after-action reports filed by the 2nd Armored Division's tank commanders. They described a confused engagement against obsolete Italian armor that resulted in minimal friendly casualties and complete destruction of enemy forces. Several reports noted that Italian tanks appeared to be firing from extreme range, their shells striking short or ricocheting off glacis plates without penetration. One Sherman commander, Lieutenant Robert Hayes of B Company, 66th Armored Regiment, wrote in his diary, "The Italian tanks looked like toys compared to ours. Their guns couldn't hurt us. It felt wrong, like shooting at targets on a range, except these targets shot back uselessly before we destroyed them." This asymmetry extended beyond armor specifications to every aspect of the engagement. American tanks carried radios that allowed real-time coordination between platoons and companies, enabling them to concentrate fire and maneuver in combined arms teams with infantry and artillery. Italian tanks often relied on flag signals or runners to communicate. Their radio sets, when they functioned at all, plagued by short range and interference. American crews trained for months in gunnery ranges that simulated combat conditions, firing hundreds of practice rounds until target acquisition became instinctive. Italian crews, constrained by ammunition shortages, might fire a dozen training rounds in their entire service before seeing combat. Maintenance and logistics favored the Americans overwhelmingly. A damaged Sherman could be recovered by dedicated tank retriever vehicles, repaired in mobile workshops equipped with arc welders and machine tools, and returned to service within days. A damaged M1340 often became a permanent loss, cannibalized for parts or abandoned because recovery vehicles lacked the power to tow it over rough terrain. American supply columns delivered fuel and ammunition in quantities that seemed almost wasteful to Italian observers. Shermans carried enough spare fuel and oil to run their engines continuously, to maneuver freely without worrying about conservation. Italian tankers counted every liter, planned every movement to minimize consumption, and still ran dry. The psychological impact of this disparity cannot be overstated. Italian tank crews entered combat knowing their vehicles were inferior, that survival depended more on luck and American incompetence than on their own skill or equipment. They fought anyway, out of duty, out of pride, out of sheer stubborn refusal to surrender without resistance. But the knowledge hollowed them out from within. Every engagement confirmed what they already believed. They were outmatched, outgunned, and doomed to lose unless they could somehow avoid direct confrontation entirely. Some Italian commanders attempted asymmetric tactics. They positioned M13-40s in concealed ambush positions, waiting until Shermans passed before firing into thinner side and rear armor. They coordinated with anti-tank gun crews and infantry assault teams, trying to overwhelm American tanks through combined arms rather than tank versus tank duels. Occasionally, these tactics achieved local successes. A Sherman caught in narrow Sicilian streets, unable to maneuver, could be disabled by determined infantry with satchel charges. An isolated American tank, separated from its platoon, might fall victim to a carefully planned ambush. But these victories were drops in an ocean of defeat. For every clever ambush, 10 straightforward engagements ended with Italian tanks burning, and Sherman columns rolling forward unimpeded. The fundamental problem remained unsolvable. Italian industry could not produce tanks that matched American designs, and Italian logistics could not sustain the kind of mechanized warfare that American doctrine demanded. By mid-July 1943, as Allied forces closed on Messina, Italy's armored units in Sicily had effectively ceased to exist as fighting formations. Giuseppe Ferretti never returned to tank service. On July 25, 1943, 12 days after the battle at Gela, Benito Mussolini was deposed in a coup orchestrated by King Victor Emmanuel III and senior military leaders. The new Italian government, led by Marshal Pietro Badoglio, opened secret negotiations with the Allies. On September 8, Italy announced its surrender and switched sides, joining the Allied cause against Nazi Germany. Ferretti, by then reassigned to an infantry unit in southern Italy, found himself in the strange position of fighting alongside American forces and occasionally seeing, up close, the Shermans that had destroyed his tank and killed his crew. He never spoke much about what he felt, watching those same olive-drab behemoths rumble past now as allies rather than enemies. His letters home, preserved in Italian military archives, contain only oblique references. The Americans have everything we lacked: food, fuel, equipment that works. I do not know whether to feel grateful or ashamed. In one letter, written in December 1943, he described watching a Sherman crew perform maintenance on their tank, laying out spare parts and tools in neat rows, working with the casual confidence of men who knew replacements would arrive if anything broke. They treat their tanks like farmers treat tractors, he wrote. Useful tools, nothing more. We treated ours like precious relics, irreplaceable and fragile. Perhaps that difference explains everything. The Italian armored forces never recovered from Sicily. When the Italian Social Republic, Mussolini's puppet state in northern Italy, attempted to field tank units after September 1943, it relied entirely on German-provided vehicles, operating as auxiliary formations within Wehrmacht divisions. The few remaining M1340s and their successors were relegated to training duties or static defense, their obsolescence so complete that even the desperate battles of Italy's final 2 years could find no use for them. In contrast, the Sherman continued evolving throughout the war. American factories produced over 49,000 Shermans between 1942 and 1945, equipping not only U.S. armored divisions but also British, Soviet, Free French, and numerous other Allied forces. Later variants mounted more powerful 76mm guns, improved armor, and better transmissions, addressing weaknesses revealed in combat. The Sherman fought across every theater of World War II, from the Normandy beaches to the Philippine jungles, and remained in service with various armies into the 1950s and beyond. The M13-40 faded into obscurity. Military historians remember it primarily as an example of how not to design a tank, a cautionary tale about the dangers of industrial backwardness and flawed doctrinal assumptions. Italian veterans remember it differently, as a steel coffin they were ordered to fight in, a testament to courage expended in a hopeless cause. There is a museum in Turin, housed in a restored factory that once manufactured tank components during the war. Among its exhibits stands a preserved M1340, restored to parade condition. its riveted plates painted in desert camouflage from the North African campaigns. The placard beside it lists specifications and service history in dry, factual prose. It does not mention Giuseppe Ferretti or Dante Rossi or the Calabrian boy whose name Ferretti could never quite remember in the years after the war. It does not describe the moment when American 75mm shells punched through Italian armor as if it were paper, or the sound of ammunition cooking off inside burning hulls, or the particular quality of light on Sicilian wheat fields in the summer of 1943. But sometimes, if you stand before that tank long enough, you can imagine what it must have been like to crouch inside that cramped steel interior, peering through narrow vision slits at an enemy whose very presence represented an industrial and technological gulf you could not cross. To fire your gun knowing the shell would ricochet harmlessly away. To watch the enemy's turret traverse toward you with mechanical precision. And to understand in that final instant that courage and skill and desperation would not be enough, had never been enough, could never be enough against the simple physics of armor plate and kinetic energy and production capacity. The Sherman that destroyed Ferretti's tank no longer exists. It was likely scrapped for metal in the post-war years, its steel recycled into automobiles or construction girders or kitchen appliances. Its crew, if they survived the war, returned to American farms and factories and offices, their service recorded in dusty archives and gradually fading memory. They might have thought occasionally about Sicily, about the Italian tanks they destroyed that morning near Gela, but probably without dwelling on the details. It had been war. They had done their duty. The Italian tanks had been inferior, and that was simply how things were. For Giuseppe Ferretti, who survived the war and lived until 1987, the memory never faded with such convenient simplicity. He carried it through Italy's reconstruction, through decades of peace and prosperity, through the slow transformation of his country from fascist dictatorship to democratic republic. He rarely spoke of the war, even to family, but when he did, he always returned to that moment. The Sherman's turret traversing, the gun barrel steady, the absolute certainty of what was about to happen. "We were brave," he said once, in an interview conducted for a local history project in the 1970s. But bravery was not enough. They had built something we could not match, no matter how hard we fought. That is what I remember most. Not fear, but the understanding that we had already lost before the battle began. The Americans did not defeat us through superior tactics or courage. They defeated us through steel and factories and the wealth of an entire continent poured into machines of war. Against that, what could we do? The interviewer, a young historian who had never experienced combat, asked if he felt bitter about it. Ferretti thought for a long moment before answering. "No," he said finally. "Not bitter, just aware. War is not fair. It is not noble. It is mathematics and industry, and the cold calculation of resources. The Americans understood this. We did not, or perhaps we understood but lacked the capacity to do anything about it. Either way, the result was the same. The sun had climbed high by the time the Shermans finished their work near Gela that July morning. The wheat fields, golden in the early light, were now scarred with tank tracks and shell craters, dotted with burning wrecks that sent columns of black smoke into the clear Sicilian sky. The smell of cordite and burning fuel oil hung in the still air. American infantry moved forward through the grain, cautious and alert, their rifles ready for any remaining resistance. There was none. The Italian armored counterattack had lasted less than 2 hours, from first contact to final destruction. 14 tanks destroyed, dozens of crewmen killed. A carefully planned operation reduced to smoking debris and shattered metal. The Shermans continued inland, their tracks grinding over the same roads that Ferretti's M1340 had traveled just hours before, moving with the unhurried confidence of machines that knew nothing could stop them. In the ditch where he lay hidden, Giuseppe Ferretti listened to them pass. The ground trembled with their weight. The sound of their engines seemed to go on forever, an endless mechanical procession that spoke of resources and power beyond anything Italy could muster. He closed his eyes and waited for silence, for the moment when he could crawl from his hiding place and begin the long walk toward whatever came next. He did not know then that he would survive the war, that he would live to see his country rebuilt and transformed, that he would eventually tell his story to researchers and historians trying to understand what those years had meant. He knew only that his crew was dead, his tank destroyed, and that the Americans had won not through brilliant strategy or heroic action, but through simple, overwhelming superiority in every measurable dimension of military power. It was a lesson that would reshape the post-war world, though he could not see it yet. The same industrial capacity that produced Shermans by the tens of thousands would rebuild Europe through the Marshall Plan, would establish American hegemony through economic and military might, would define the global order for generations to come. The tank battle at Gela was not a decisive engagement in military terms. Sicily would fall regardless of whether Italian armor resisted or retreated, but it crystallized a truth that would echo through the decades. Modern war was an industrial enterprise, and the nation that mastered industrial production would dominate the battlefield. Giuseppe Ferretti, lying in muddy water and listening to Sherman engines fade into the distance, understood this truth with terrible clarity. He had fired his gun and watched his shells bounce away. He had felt his tank shatter under American fire. He had lost men he cared about to a mismatch so profound that courage and skill meant nothing against it. And somewhere across the Mediterranean, in factories that ran 3 shifts a day, American workers were building more Shermans, more guns, more of everything, an endless tide of material that would wash away any resistance through sheer overwhelming abundance. The wheat fields of Sicily would green again in future summers, but the lesson written in burned-out tanks and shattered armor would endure. Not all struggles are won by the brave or the skilled. Some are decided before the first shot is fired, in the foundries and factories and furnaces where industrial nations forge their power. The sun climbed higher. The smoke from burning tanks rose straight up in the windless air, marking the places where Italian armor had made its stand and died. And Giuseppe Ferretti, survivor and witness, began the long journey toward understanding what it meant to fight on the wrong side of history's industrial divide, to be brave and skilled and determined, and to lose anyway, because the enemy had built something that courage alone could never overcome.